The red dust of Katsina swirled around Apostle Johnson Selman's feet as he stood beneath the ancient baobab tree that had watched over his family's compound for 7 generations. The morning sun painted the adobe walls of his prayer house in shades of amber and gold, while the distant call of the muezzin from the town mosque created a familiar melody that had greeted every dawn of his 53 years. His weathered hands, scarred from years of manual labor before his calling, trembled slightly as they held the sealed envelope bearing the official seal of the President of the United States. The messenger, a young diplomat with nervous eyes and a too-clean suit that spoke of air-conditioned offices and filtered water, had departed in his black SUV, leaving behind only dust clouds and the weight of unprecedented attention. "Baba," his daughter Hawa called from the doorway of their home, her voice carrying the musical lilt of Hausa tinged with concern. "The elders are gathering. Word has spread through the market like wildfire in the Harmattan season." Johnson Selman, known to his congregation as simply Apostle, nodded without turning. His eyes remained fixed on the envelope, feeling the pulse of destiny thrumming through the paper like a heartbeat. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of approaching motorcycles and the honking of commercial buses bringing the curious from neighboring villages. The irony was not lost on him. Here he stood, a man who had spent his youth fighting against the very Western influences that now sought to honor him, holding a letter from the most powerful leader in the world. The same world that had once tried to reshape his people in its own image, had drawn lines across ancient kingdoms and planted flags in sacred grounds. "Ancestors guided me," he whispered in Hausa, pressing the envelope against his chest. "Let me understand the weight of this moment." Inside his prayer house, a simple rectangular structure with walls of sun-dried brick and a corrugated iron roof, Apostle Johnson Selman finally broke the seal. The ceiling fans whirred overhead, stirring the air thick with incense and the lingering echoes of 1,000 prayers. Faded photographs of his spiritual journey lined the walls. His baptism in the Niger River, his first sermon under this very baobab tree, his pilgrimage to Jerusalem where he had prayed at the Western Wall and felt the stones speak to him in ancient tongues. The letter unfolded with the crisp precision of official correspondence, but the words within carried an unexpected warmth that made his heart skip. "Dear Apostle Johnson Selman, your voice has traveled across oceans and continents, carrying with it the undeniable power of faith rooted in authentic soil. In a world increasingly divided by fear and misunderstanding, your ministry stands as a beacon of unity, wisdom and genuine spiritual authority that transcends borders and cultures. I write to you not merely as the President of the United States, but as a fellow human being who recognizes the profound impact of your work in bridging divides that many consider unbridgeable. Your recent crusade for peace in the Niger Delta, where you stood between warring factions and spoke truth to power with the authority of one who serves a higher calling, has not gone unnoticed by those of us who labor in the complex arena of international relations." The apostle paused, his eyes widening. The Niger Delta mission had been the most dangerous of his career. 3 weeks spent in the creeks and swamplands, moving between oil-soaked villages and militant camps, preaching reconciliation while bullets whispered overhead and the stench of crude oil mixed with the sweet fragrance of justice delayed but not denied. He had lost 15 pounds during those weeks, sustained only by Gary and prayer, sleeping in leaking boats and walking through communities where children played with spent shell casings and grandmothers sang lullabies that incorporated the rhythm of distant gunfire. But something had shifted in the spiritual realm during those dark nights. Chiefs who had not spoken in decades began to listen. Militants who had sworn blood oaths laid down weapons worn smooth by desperate hands. The letter continued. "Your approach to peacemaking, rooted in the ancient wisdom of your ancestors yet speaking to universal human longings for dignity, justice and hope, offers a model that the world's diplomatic community would do well to study and emulate. You have accomplished in 3 weeks what our most sophisticated negotiation teams could not achieve in 3 years. But more than your results, it is your method that commands respect. You do not arrive with the presumption of superiority that has characterized too much of Western engagement with Africa. You do not seek to impose foreign solutions on indigenous problems. Instead, you dig deep into the wellsprings of cultural wisdom, ancestral knowledge, and spiritual authority that have sustained your people through centuries of challenge and change." Outside, the sounds of gathering grew louder. Vehicles arriving, voices rising in animated discussion, the shuffle of feet on sandy ground. Through the window he could see Maulam Ibrahim, the local imam, approaching with measured steps, his white kaftan brilliant against the red earth. Behind him walked Chief Usman, the traditional ruler whose lineage traced back to the great kingdoms of Hausaland, his ornate walking stick catching the light with each deliberate step. These were the men who had watched Johnson Selman grow from a restless youth who questioned everything to a spiritual leader who questioned even more deeply but with the wisdom that comes from encountering the divine in unexpected places. The apostle's mind drifted back 30 years, to the young man he had been, angry, brilliant, and convinced that the solutions to Africa's problems lay in complete rejection of anything that smelled of Western influence. He had been a student leader at Ahmadu Bello University, organizing protests against World Bank structural adjustment programs, writing fiery articles and underground publications that circulated like Sami's literature through the dormitories and student unions. His transformation had not come through any Damascus Road experience, but through a slower, more patient work of the Spirit that unfolded over years of wrestling with contradictions that refused easy resolution. The Christianity that reached him had not arrived in the baggage of colonial missionaries, but through the testimony of local evangelists who preached in Hausa, who incorporated traditional proverbs into their sermons, who understood that the gospel had to take root in native soil or remain forever foreign. His calling to ministry had crystallized during the religious riots of the early 2000s, when ancient ethnic and religious tensions exploded into violence that left hundreds dead and thousands displaced. While politicians made speeches and journalists filed reports, Johnson Selman had walked into the burning neighborhoods with nothing but a Bible, a Quran, and an unshakable conviction that the same God who had made the Hausa and the Igbo and the Yoruba had not intended them to destroy each other in his name. He had spent days moving between Christian and Muslim communities, sleeping in both churches and mosques, sharing meals with families who had lost children to the violence, praying with old men whose beards were white with age and wisdom but whose eyes still burned with the pain of injustice. It was there, in those ashes of sectarian hatred, that he had discovered his unique calling: to stand in the spaces where worlds collided and speak the language of reconciliation with an accent that all could understand. The letter from the American president continued. Your work challenges us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about conflict resolution, about the role of faith in public life, and about the relationship between local wisdom and global challenges. In a time when many seek to build walls and emphasize differences, you build bridges and emphasize our common humanity. I am writing to invite you to address the United Nations General Assembly during our upcoming special session on global peace and reconciliation. Your voice, speaking from the deep wells of African wisdom and spiritual authority, would add a dimension to our discussions that no amount of political expertise or economic analysis can provide. The apostles' hands began to shake more visibly. The United Nations, the gathering place of world leaders, where decisions were made that affected millions of lives, where the powerful negotiated with the powerful while the powerless waited for the results. He had seen it on television, of course, that imposing building in New York with its flags of every nation, its halls where translators worked in glass booths and diplomats spoke in careful, coded language that said much while revealing little. But what would he, a man whose greatest congregation had been 10,000 people gathered in a field outside Kaduna, say to representatives of 193 nations? What words could bridge the vast chasms between his red earth wisdom and their marble corridor politics? The answer came to him with the sudden clarity that had marked every major decision of his ministry. He would speak the same words he had always spoken, in the same voice he had always used. Truth did not change its nature based on its audience. Justice did not require translation. The cry for dignity sounded the same whether it rose from a Niger Delta fishing village or the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations. By midday the compound was filled with visitors. They came on foot and on motorcycles, in battered taxis and borrowed cars, creating an impromptu gathering that transformed the quiet family compound into something resembling a town hall meeting. Women spread mats under the shade of the baobab tree, their children playing games that involved elaborate rules and much laughter. Men clustered in discussion groups, their voices rising and falling in the rhythmic patterns of debate that had governed community decision-making since time immemorial. Malam Ibrahim had brought his own chair, a sign of respect that indicated he intended to stay for the duration of whatever was to unfold. Chief Usman had sent ahead a servant with a cooler of Coca-Cola and cola nuts, traditional symbols of hospitality that acknowledged the gravity of the occasion. Even Pastor Dauda from the ECWA church had arrived, despite the theological differences that had created a polite distance between the two men's ministries for nearly a decade. The apostle emerged from his prayer house to find himself facing a crowd that represented the full spectrum of his community: traditional rulers and modern professionals, Islamic scholars and Christian ministers, market women and university students, all united by curiosity about what the American president had written to their local son who had somehow become a global figure. He looked at their faces, weathered by sun and struggle, animated by intelligence and hope, marked by the particular beauty that comes from surviving difficult times without losing one's humanity, and felt the weight of representation settling on his shoulders like a ceremonial robe. These were his people, but they were also much more than that. They were the descendants of kingdoms that had traded with North Africa when Europe was emerging from its dark ages. They were the inheritors of intellectual traditions that had produced great centers of learning when libraries were being burned elsewhere. They were the keepers of spiritual wisdom that had sustained communities through slavery, colonialism, and the ongoing challenges of independence. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying easily across the compound without amplification, trained by years of open-air preaching to reach the furthest listener. "Today I have received a letter that concerns not just me but all of us. For when the world seeks to honor one among us, it acknowledges the worth of all of us." He held up the letter, its official letterhead catching the sunlight. "The President of the United States has written to invite me to speak at the United Nations about peace and reconciliation. He has written that our ways of making peace, the ways of our ancestors, the ways of our communities, the ways we have learned in this red earth of Katsina, have something to teach the world." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound like wind through grain fields. In that murmur the apostle heard pride, surprise, skepticism, and hope intermingled in proportions that spoke to the complexity of his community's relationship with global recognition. "But before I can speak to the world," he continued, "I must hear from you. For I am nothing more than a voice that carries your wisdom, your pain, your dreams to places where such things are not always welcome. If I am to represent us well, I must understand what representation means in this moment, in this place for these people." What followed was a conversation that lasted until the evening call to prayer, a flowing dialogue that moved between languages and generations, incorporating the wisdom of different traditions while remaining rooted in the particular soil of their shared experience. Malam Ibrahim spoke first, his Arabic-accented Hausa carrying the weight of decades spent teaching Quranic interpretation. "Apostle, you know that in Islam we believe that Allah raises up from among every people a messenger who speaks their language and understands their ways. Perhaps this is such a moment, not that you are a prophet, Astagfirullah, but that you are being called to carry our language to those who need to hear it." Chief Usman nodded slowly, his ornate cap catching the afternoon light. "Our ancestors knew how to speak to the world. The trans-Saharan trade routes brought people from many nations to our cities. But they came as guests, not as conquerors. They learned our languages, followed our customs, showed respect for our ways. If you go to this United Nations, you go not as a suppliant seeking approval, but as a son of kings carrying the wisdom of kingdoms." A woman's voice rose from the group gathered under the baobab tree, Hajia Fatima, whose small business had grown into one of the region's most successful fabric trading enterprises. "Apostle, you have seen how they treat us when we go to their embassies seeking visas. How they look at our passports as if they were contaminated. How they ask questions that assume we are all potential threats or burdens. But now they invite you to their great assembly. This is not just about you, this is about how they see us." The conversation deepened as the afternoon wore on, touching on themes that had shaped their collective experience for generations: the relationship between local wisdom and global power, the challenge of maintaining cultural authenticity while engaging with international systems, the delicate balance between speaking truth to power and avoiding the trap of being co-opted by that same power. A young university student who had returned home for the holidays, Aminu, whose scholarships had taken him to study international relations in Abuja, raised a concern that had been whispered among the younger attendees. "Apostle, we have seen how the West celebrates our leaders when they say what the West wants to hear, and abandons them when they speak uncomfortable truths. How do we know this invitation is not a trap? How do we know they want to hear our real voice, not just a sanitized version that makes them feel good about themselves?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a cooking fire, acrid and persistent. It was the question that haunted every interaction between the formerly colonized and their former colonizers, the eternal suspicion that respect was conditional, that acceptance required accommodation, that being heard meant being willing to speak only certain kinds of truth. The apostle sat in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of all the eyes upon him, understanding that his answer would shape not only his own decision but his community's understanding of their place in a global conversation that had too often proceeded without their voices. "My son," he said finally, addressing Aminu directly, "your question shows the wisdom that comes from education joined with experience. You are right to be suspicious. We have seen our leaders travel to foreign capitals and return speaking in tongues we do not recognize, advocating for policies that serve distant interests while our own people remain in poverty." He stood and walked to the baobab tree, placing his hand on its ancient bark, drawing strength from its deep roots and its centuries of survival through drought and plenty, storm and calm. But consider this tree, he continued. It does not grow by rejecting the soil or by trying to become something other than what it is. It grows by sending its roots deeper, by drawing up from the earth the nutrients that make it strong, by stretching toward the light while remaining anchored in the place of its birth. He turned back to face the crowd, his voice gaining the rhythmic cadence of the traditional storyteller. If I go to this United Nations, I go as a son of this soil. I go carrying the stories you have told me, the prayers you have taught me, the wisdom you have shared with me. I go not to please them or to be accepted by them, but to plant seeds of our truth in ground that has been too long barren of such planting. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to set the very air ablaze, the conversation took on a different quality. The practical concerns gave way to deeper contemplations about identity, purpose, and destiny that reached beyond the immediate question of the UN invitation to touch on fundamental questions about who they were as a people and what they were called to become. An elderly man who had remained silent throughout the afternoon finally spoke. This was Baba Tanko, whose age was measured not in years but in the accumulation of wisdom that marked him as one of the community's most respected voices. His walking stick was carved from ironwood and topped with symbols that spoke of traditional authority predating any colonial interruption. Apostle, Baba Tanko said, his voice thin but carrying clearly across the compound, you speak of representing us, but let me ask you this. What is it that we want the world to know about us that they do not already know? The question was deceptively simple, but it cut to the heart of the post-colonial dilemma that had shaped African engagement with the global community for decades. What was the authentic African voice? How did one speak from African identity without falling into either romanticization or defensiveness? How did one claim dignity while acknowledging problems, assert worth while seeking partnership, maintain independence while engaging interdependence? They know us as a place of problems, Hajiya Fatima said, answering Baba Tanko's question with the directness that characterized successful businesswomen. Poverty, conflict, disease, corruption. When they think of Africa, they think of things that need to be fixed. They know us as history, added Pastor Dauda, his theological training showing in his systematic approach to the question. Ancient kingdoms, colonial exploitation, struggle for independence. We are either primitive past or tragic present, never contemporary actors with something valuable to contribute to their future. They know us as resources, said Chief Usman, his words carrying the bitterness of a traditional ruler who had watched multinational corporations extract wealth from ancestral lands while leaving communities poorer than before. Oil, gold, diamonds, uranium. They want what we have, but they do not want who we are. The apostle nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in each observation while sensing that they were approaching something deeper, something that could only be reached by moving beyond catalog of grievances to articulation of alternative vision. But what is it that we know about ourselves that they need to learn? He asked, turning the question back to the community. What is it that we carry that the world needs but cannot find elsewhere? The answers came slowly at first, then with increasing confidence as people gave voice to understandings that were rarely articulated but deeply felt. We know how to survive, said a woman whose husband had died in the religious riots, leaving her to raise 6 children alone. Not just to exist, but to survive with dignity, with hope, with love still intact. We know how to share, said a young teacher whose monthly salary was less than what many Americans spent on coffee. How to make little become much when it is divided with open hands and generous hearts. We know how to forgive, said an older man whose scars told stories of battles fought and survived. How to live with people who have wronged us, how to build peace from the ashes of conflict, how to choose reconciliation over revenge. We know how to remember, said a praise singer whose repertoire included genealogy stretching back 15 generations. How to honor the ancestors, how to learn from the past, how to carry forward the wisdom of those who came before. We know how to laugh, said a group of children who had been following the adult conversation with the sophisticated understanding that comes from growing up in communities where serious matters are discussed openly. How to find joy even when things are hard, how to make music from whatever instruments we can find, how to dance even when the ground is rough. As each voice added to the growing chorus of self-definition, the apostle felt something shifting in the spiritual atmosphere of the gathering. This was no longer a consultation about whether he should accept an invitation to speak at the United Nations. This was becoming a collective articulation of identity, a community-wide process of defining themselves not in response to external perception but from the authority of lived experience and inherited wisdom. We know how to pray, he added, his voice joining the chorus while carrying the particular authority of his calling. How to speak to the divine in languages that rise from our own soil, how to find God in our own stories, how to offer worship that is authentic to who we are rather than imitative of who others think we should be. The crowd grew quiet, sensing that they had reached something important, something that would shape not only the apostles' decision but their own understanding of their place in a world that too often saw them only through the lens of its own needs and assumptions. As evening approached and the call to prayer echoed across the compound, the gathering began to take on the quality of a commissioning service. What had begun as a consultation was becoming a send-off, a community blessing of a mission that would carry their collective voice to a global audience that rarely heard from communities like theirs except in terms of crisis or charity. The apostle asked for a moment of private reflection and withdrew to his prayer house, carrying with him the weight of everything that had been shared and the growing clarity of what he was being called to say. The letter from the American president lay on his desk where he had left it, but now it seemed less like an intimidating summons and more like an invitation to represent not just his own ministry but the wisdom of his entire community. He knelt on the simple prayer rug that had been his companion through decades of intercession, facing east toward Mecca out of respect for his Muslim neighbors, though his own prayers rose in the name of Jesus who had walked among the poor and spoken truth to power with an authority that earthly rulers could not diminish. Father, he prayed, if this door is from you, give me the words that will honor you and serve my people. Let me speak not as one seeking approval from the powerful, but as one carrying the concerns of the powerless to places where they can be heard. Let me represent not just my own understanding, but the collective wisdom of those who have entrusted me with their stories. The prayer deepened, moving beyond words to a place of spiritual communion where the concerns of time touched the eternal purposes of God. In that place, he began to see the outline of what he would say to the United Nations, how he would frame the wisdom of his community in language that could reach across cultural and political divides without losing its essential authenticity. When he emerged from the prayer house, the compound was lit by the warm glow of kerosene lamps and the flickering light of cell phones, creating an atmosphere that bridged traditional and modern, ancient and contemporary. The crowd had not dispersed but had settled into a more intimate configuration, with families sharing evening meals while continuing to discuss the day's revelations. My people, the apostle said, his voice carrying easily in the still evening air, I have heard your wisdom and I have prayed for guidance. If you give me your blessing, I will go to this United Nations and speak the words that you have given me to speak. He paused, looking at the faces illuminated by lamplight, seeing in them the faces of countless others who would never have the opportunity to address world leaders but whose wisdom deserved to be heard in the councils of power. I will tell them about the woman who lost her husband to religious violence but chose to send her children to both Christian and Muslim schools so they would learn that faith need not divide. I will tell them about the traditional ruler who gave up half his palace to house refugees from ethnic conflict, saying that leadership means making room for others at your table. His voice gained strength as the message took clearer shape. I will tell them about the imam and the pastor who pray together every Friday, not abandoning their distinct traditions but finding in them a common foundation for peace. I will tell them about the market women who created their own banking system when the official banks ignored them, showing that economic empowerment grows from community solidarity, not individual competition. The crowd began to murmur its approval, recognizing in his words the stories of their own lived experience, their own strategies for survival and flourishing in circumstances that often seem designed to discourage both. I will tell them about the young people who study at universities abroad but return home to invest their knowledge in their own communities, choosing contribution over emigration, building up rather than abandoning the places that formed them. I will tell them about the grandmothers who carry both traditional medicine and modern health knowledge, integrating wisdom systems that outsiders often see as contradictory. As he spoke, the apostle felt the message crystallizing into something that was both deeply rooted and universally relevant, both specifically African and broadly human. This was what he would carry to New York, not a plea for sympathy or understanding, but an offer of wisdom that the world needed if it was serious about finding sustainable solutions to the challenges that faced all of humanity. The evening concluded with a ceremony that was both spontaneous and deeply traditional, reflecting the community's instinctive understanding of how to mark significant transitions and commission important missions. Without any formal coordination, people began to form concentric circles around the apostle, with the elders closest to him and the younger generations in outer rings that extended to the edges of the compound. Malam Ibrahim stepped forward first, carrying a small clay pot filled with water from the well that had served the community for over a century. Apostle, he said, as our fathers blessed those who carried their messages to distant lands, We bless you with the water of our Father's wells. May you never forget the source of your strength, and may you always find your way back to the people who sent you forth. He sprinkled the water on the apostles' hands, then on his feet, then on his forehead, each gesture accompanied by prayers in Arabic that blended with the murmured amens of the Christian participants and the respectful silence of those from traditional backgrounds. Chief Usman followed, carrying a small pouch of red earth gathered from the roots of the baobab tree. Son of our soil, he said, using the formal language of traditional blessing, carry this earth with you as a reminder that no matter how far you travel or how high you rise, you remain connected to this place and these people. Let it ground you when the winds of foreign influence threaten to uproot you from your foundations. He placed a small amount of the earth in the apostles' palm, then touched it to his own forehead in a gesture that acknowledged their shared connection to the land and to each other. One by one, other members of the community added their blessings. The women sang traditional songs of protection and guidance. The men offered prayers for wisdom and courage. The children presented drawings they had made during the evening, depicting the apostles speaking to figures in suits and ties beneath flags they had imagined rather than seen. As the ceremony continued, the apostle felt himself being wrapped in the collective prayer and hope of his community, understanding that he would carry to New York not just his own voice but the accumulated wisdom and aspiration of people whose names would never appear in international headlines but whose lives represented the real work of building peace, creating justice, and maintaining dignity in circumstances that often made all three seem impossible. The final blessing came from Baba Tanko, whose age and wisdom gave him the authority to speak for the ancestors and for the future generations alike. Leaning heavily on his ironwood staff, he approached the apostle with steps that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "My son," he said, his thin voice somehow carrying more power than all the microphones and amplifiers in the world, "you go to speak for us, but remember that you also go to listen for us. The world has much to teach as well as much to learn. Bring back to us not just the satisfaction of being heard, but the wisdom of having listened." He placed his hand on the apostle's head, a gesture that connected the young man to the unbroken chain of spiritual authority that stretched back through generations of leaders who had guided their people through challenges that would have destroyed communities with less resilient wisdom. "Go with the blessing of the ancestors," Baba Tanko concluded. "Go with the hope of the living. Go with the dreams of the unborn. And return to us with the knowledge that you have served well the God who made us all and the land that made us who we are." 3 weeks later, Apostle Johnson Selman stood in the Visitors' Gallery of the United Nations General Assembly, looking down at the semicircular arrangement of desks where representatives from 193 nations would soon gather to hear him speak. The building was everything he had imagined and nothing he had expected. Impressive in its scale and ambition, yet somehow smaller than the open-air gatherings where he was accustomed to preaching, more formal than the community meetings where real decisions were made through patient consensus building rather than parliamentary procedure. His journey to New York had been a revelation in itself. The airplane that lifted him from the red earth of Katsina had carried him over landscapes that told the story of his continent. The Sahara Desert where ancient trade routes had connected civilizations, the forests where kingdoms had risen and fallen, the coastlines where slave ships had departed and independence celebrations had been held, the cities where modern Africa was being built by young people who refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose on their dreams. In his briefcase, carefully wrapped in silk, he carried the pouch of red earth that Chief Usman had blessed, along with a small vial of water from the community well and a photo of the evening blessing ceremony that captured the faces of the people who had sent him forth. These were his credentials, more meaningful to him than the official invitation or the diplomatic passport that had eased his passage through international borders. The speech he would deliver had been written and rewritten dozens of times during the weeks of preparation, but its core remained unchanged. He would speak the truth that his community had commissioned him to speak, using their wisdom to address challenges that were both local and global, both ancient and contemporary. As the delegates began to file into the assembly hall, the apostle offered a silent prayer that connected him to the community gathered beneath the baobab tree in Katsina, to the ancestors whose wisdom flowed through his words, and to the God who had called him to build bridges across the chasms that divided humanity from itself. The message was ready. The messenger was prepared. The moment had arrived for the voice of a small community in northern Nigeria to address the councils of the world, carrying with it the power of authentic witness and the authority of lived truth. In his heart he carried the blessing of his people. In his hands he held the future of their representation on the global stage. And in his voice, he would offer the world the gift of wisdom that had been tested in the fires of real experience and found both durable and transformative. The red earth of Katsina would speak that day in the marble halls of Manhattan. and the world would be invited to listen with the respect due to truth spoken from the authority of genuine spiritual power rooted in authentic community wisdom. The message had traveled from the American president to the African apostle and back again, transformed by its journey through communities that knew how to turn invitation into opportunity, recognition into responsibility, and global platform into service to local wisdom. As his name was announced and he rose to address the assembly, Apostle Johnson Selman carried with him the prayers of his people, the wisdom of his ancestors, and the unshakable conviction that the voice of the marginalized, when spoken with authority and authenticity, had the power to transform the conversations that shaped the world. The baobab tree had sent forth one of its sons to plant seeds of African wisdom in global soil. The harvest would belong to generations yet unborn, but the planting would happen here, now, in this moment when two worlds met in the person of a man who had learned to speak truth in languages that both could understand. The speech that followed would be remembered as a turning point in international discourse about conflict resolution, sustainable development, and the role of indigenous wisdom in addressing global challenges. But that is another story for another day, rooted in the same red earth that had nurtured this one and watered by the same springs of community wisdom that had blessed this messenger and would bless others who would follow in his footsteps.